Well, welcome everyone. Welcome today. We're so glad to have everyone today, and we're so excited about the conversation that we'll also be having today with Mr. Jelani Memory. Mr. Jelani Memory is an entrepreneur, a thinker, and a constant learner. He was formerly the founder and chief product officer at Circle, and now he's the co-founder and CEO at a company called A Kid's Book About Inc. It's a new kids media brand that really tells challenging and empowering and important stories, not only for kids, but for grown-ups as well. Today, we'll be talking about the topic of how to really talk to kids about racism. He currently lives in Portland, Oregon with his beautiful wife and 6 kids. And believe it or not, he still wants to be an artist when he grows up. We're so excited to have this conversation, especially in the climate that we're in today, in society and in America. So without further ado, I do want to pass it on to Mr. Jelani Memory.
Howdy, folks. Such a pleasure to be here. I always love when I get invited to talk, and hopefully I say something useful and beneficial for you as you navigate your work life, your parent life, and if indeed you are a parent, family life, and just daily life when it comes to the topic of race. So I'm going to share my screen real quick and bring up my presentation. So bear with me for a moment. Share. We're going to go over. I'm going to press play. Look at that. All right. I just hope everybody can see that. I'm going to assume that everybody can see that. The title of my talk is How Do We Talk to Kids About Racism? And it's a little bit coy because that's not actually what I'm going to talk about, but it's the number one question that I get asked. So I figured I might as well title my talk that, even though I'm going to talk about something else, or at least talk about something more than just that. I think it's the wrong question fundamentally. It presumes a lot. It presumes that there is a how. It presumes that we should talk to kids about racism, and it presumes that I can teach you that. Some of those things are true. Some of those things are not true. So the big question is, why am I here then? I think for 3 reasons. First is, with the murder of George Floyd last year, we entered a new world. The world truly and fundamentally changed. There was a before George Floyd and there was an after, just like there was a before Selma and there was an after Selma. So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is I wrote a book called A Kid's Book About Racism. And now people seem to think I'm an expert on this topic. And so I will disabuse you of that, hopefully throughout this talk, while also hopefully offering you some helpful tips, some helpful tricks, some helpful ideas, mostly from me just as a person and as a father. And then number 3 is me, is my story. Growing up as a Black kid in the whitest city in America, I've got lots of experiences to share. And I think my family history plays in a great deal, as well as some stories that I have to share. So I'm going to start in reverse order and go through these 3 things. And again, hopefully I disabuse you of the idea that I'm an expert on any of this stuff other than my story. And hopefully you come out of it with some really wonderful questions to ask yourself, to ask your spouse, to ask your kid, and to ask yourself, and maybe just to ask me. So let's start with number 3, me, my experience. I want to tell you about my childhood. I want to tell you about my college life. I want to tell you about my life now. So let's start back in 1992. Now, I wasn't born then. I was born in 83, so I must have been about 9 at this point. And as all 9-year-old boys in the country, were thinking about at that time, I was thinking about comics. And specifically this comic that came out then, I was enamored with Superman, and the idea that Superman could be killed was like the craziest thing on earth. So, this was like the biggest event. It was bigger than, just about anything, including, the big tentpole Marvel movies now. My whole world as a kid was comic books. I read them, I drew them, I loved them. They were this magical world that I could dive into, that I could escape into, this diverse world, right? And in these world of the comic books, it was full of heroes, right? A man who was super strong with a cool shield, or a woman with the golden lasso that could like make you tell the truth. The guy with the claws in his hands, Wolverine. These superhuman beings would show up and they would protect the weak, and they would uh, show up when you needed them most to save the day. And I think I fell in love with comic books as a kid because that wasn't my world and that's not our world. We know we don't live in a world where the good guys always show up at the right time to do the right thing. And even when they do, sometimes they're not powerful enough to do anything about it. So this is me. I know I look happy here. I'm a cute kid, but my world was pretty awful as a kid. I don't have any memories underneath 5, but by this time, my dad would have left. My mom would have been working nights as a nurse and sleeping most of the days, just getting off her heroin addiction. And I was left in a lot of ways to fend for myself, youngest of 4 siblings. Soon after this picture was taken, my dad, right there, center right, would have left. And while we look like a decently happy family, both of my parents were drug addicts and didn't know how to take care of us, didn't know how to give us what we needed. And thankfully, my mom got clean and did provide us a life where we at least had a shot. But man, we had it tough as kids. You can see there's no dad in this picture. He's gone by this point. Got my 2 sisters. My mom actually looks happy. My brother, I idolized my brother. I wanted to dress like him. I wanted to play basketball like him. He was the guy I looked up to. It turns out he would end up abusing me before he went off to college. Now, I was a smart kid. I should have done well in school, but I just didn't care. And I didn't have any parents at home who said, hey, Jelani, you should actually do your homework. So I never did. Never was told to clean my room. Never was told to come home early and not stay out, after midnight. By the time I was 12, sexually active, drugs, no supervision. Again, I look happy, but all the stuff happening underneath is just too much. And again, I'm a black kid in a very white city, surrounded by white kids. I was one of 3 black kids in my entire school. And so racism was the water that I swam in, truly. By the time I was a senior in high school, I played 3 varsity sports. I was easily the most popular kid in school, and I hated my life, genuinely. I wasn't happy. I was what they would call clinically depressed, and I had 0 direction. Now, that's a lot. And it might make you wonder, what on earth am I doing here today talking to you? That sounds pretty terrible. So clearly something must have changed, right? Because here's me today. Those are my 6 kids. I've got 4 wonderful stepkids, 2 biological kids. I've got a wonderful wife. And we, believe it or not, are actually happy. So if you're not asking yourself how, you should be asking yourself how. Heroes. I had heroes in my life, genuine, true, wonderful heroes. No, not this kind. None of them could ride around on a silver board or shoot webbing out of their hand or climb walls or fly or run faster than the speed of light. These heroes were everyday folks. Folks who gave me free art lessons like Jay Ferrier, or like Roger Churchill, who paid for my soccer gear because my family didn't have enough money to do it. or like Dave Rasmussen, who treated me like a brother and like a friend and was the first real father figure I think I ever had. Ryan Lane, a man who I'd call my first best friend, my roommate from college. And Lance Charlish, who bought me my first camera and allowed me to start a career as a photographer that I ran for a decade. I could go on from Gary, who let me sleep under his roof and taught me how to be generous, to Kevin, who taught me to be courageous and become an entrepreneur, to Paul, who sat, day after day in therapy sessions, just listening to me. These were all heroes to me, genuinely, truly. So that's thing one, my experience. Let's go to thing two, my book. Back in 2018, I was the co-founder and chief product officer of a company called Circle and was burned out. I wasn't happy. I was, unmotivated. I couldn't get my creative juices going. And so I decided to do something with a new son on the way, now 2.5, Solomon, just about to be born. I wanted him to make sense of his racial identity. I wanted him to make sense of his skin color. And I wanted him to know what he had in store for him, that he was going to be making sense of himself to everyone else in his life for the rest of his life. And I wanted my other kids, especially my white kids, to be able to talk about race, culture, color, and racism. And so what did I do? I did what any dad would do, I think, I hope, is I made a book for them. Not a book for Penguin or Simon and Schuster or McGraw-Hill or one to be published. I made a book for my 6 kids because I wanted to be a good dad, and not having a dad growing up, it meant that it was on me to sort of figure out how to do this thing for them. And I thought making a book on an important topic that just started a conversation or kept a conversation going was one thing that I could do that would be really meaningful. I'm not a writer. I'm not a designer. I'm okay at both. So I spent a week writing a book. I spent a week designing the book, and I printed 1 copy because I wasn't sure what I would do with 2. It was just for my kids. That book has gone on to sell, over 50 or 60,000 copies. It's made it into homes all over the world, Australia, the UK, Mexico, Canada, and of course, all across the United States. When I showed it to my kids, they had this amazing response. They said, "This is awesome, Dad. Can we make our own books too?" And they suggested to me incredible, but really challenging topics like divorce or sadness or depression. For something about my book unlocked that permission to talk about something hard. So I ended up leaving my other company to go start a new one that was going to be focused on telling the most important stories that kids ever heard from first-person voices, not experts. I'm not an expert, but owned voices, folks who've really lived and breathed this stuff, direct to kids, honest, straightforward, for kids 5 to 9 to start these really important conversations. Now we're almost at 50 books in 18 months. We think that in the equation of grown up and kid, it's the grown up who's afraid to talk about something like racism, not the kid. They don't get uncomfortable. They don't get unsure. They don't fumble over their words. They're totally ready to talk about it. It's us adults who think it's impolite, or we're unsure, or we don't know what to say or when to say it or how to say it. These books are changing kids' lives. And I'm really incredibly proud of them. They're on topics from everything from newly released books that we have, like being non-binary or being transgender, to emotions, belonging, empathy, death, cancer, body image, white privilege, gratitude, shame, you name it. And so somehow out of this, I became a best-selling author when all I really did was I took my experience, I took my story, and I gave it to my kids. Now let's get to the third one, Remember, these are all reasons why I'm here, but I'm not an expert. My world. Now, it used to be that among company, among friends, among white folks, I would be the only one who would broach the topic of racism, who would talk about it, who would talk about the social inequities, who would talk about police brutality, who would talk about my experiences or those of other Black and brown folks. But something really changed this last summer. I remember, there was a moment about a week after the video of George Floyd being murdered was released where I was chatting with another friend, a guy who grew up here in Portland, just outside of Portland, in a little city called Aloha. Um, and I was like, man, what is happening? I've got white people hitting me up nonstop. And not just because I wrote a kid's book about racism, but friends, folks I've known for a very long time who are trying to find a way to navigate now, who are trying to find a way to talk about this, who are trying to find a way to understand my experience or the experience of Black and brown individuals in this country. And it was just like, what happened? Because for myself and for my friend Jordan and for many of my other friends and family members, we had continually watched Black men be murdered again and again and again, whether at the hands of police or marauding individuals in trucks, you name it. And I'm not sure what changed. I'm not sure what it was about George Floyd's death and murder. I don't know. It might have been that the pandemic, was reaching its, fifth or sixth month. It might have been that we were all fed up and we couldn't leave our house. It might have been that we were already experiencing so much death and destruction. It might have been that it was just time. But post George Floyd, a huge portion of our country woke up and they started to really think about race and how that might color one's experience in this country, how that might color one's experience in their job, how that might color one's experience growing up. And so conversations started, and I was really happy that my book was there as a resource for moms, for dads, for parents, for aunties, for uncles, for grandparents, for teachers, for therapists, for psychologists, to at least start the conversation, to use the word racism in their home, even if they didn't know what to say, to start talking about it. Because for a big portion of the country, it's our daily experience. It's our lived experience, and it affects much of our lives. It's not something that happened a long time ago that somehow Martin Luther King Jr. fixed with a speech about dreams. It's something that exists today. So it's our world now. It's not just my world. And I think these three reasons are why I'm here today. And I think it's important that we talk about these things. And I also think that I'm not an expert necessarily to facilitate that conversation, but only hopefully to give permission to go, it's okay to have it. It's okay to have that conversation, whether it's about police brutality, whether it's about racism, whether it's about microaggressions, whether it's about systemic racism, whether it's about white privilege, and that you don't have to be an expert to have it, and that you're not going to get everything right. So my hope is that now we can talk about it. Now everything's on the table. Now it's okay. I've given you permission, and we can invite the youngest people in our lives into that conversation, that it's okay to let them into, that they're never too young. It's never too early. So this is my favorite part of my talks, and the most important part, the questions. So I'm going to get rid of my presentation, and hopefully we have a rousing discussion that's actually about how to talk to kids about racism, because I feel just as equipped as you all talking about it, answering questions, and engaging in that conversation.
All right, thank you so much, Jelani. This is Katherine Curtis, and I'm going to help facilitate the questions. We do have a Q&A at the bottom of the screen, so if you would like to ask a question, you can pop it in there, and we will just start going through them. I think one person asked in the chat, where did you grow up?
Yeah, Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
Yeah, that's home for me.
So what is the first thing we should ask our children about racism?
So here's my challenge to you with that question is, what do you have to offer your kids when it comes to the topic of racism? And that's really about not trying to go further than your own knowledge, not trying to go further than the things you have to share. It's really important to me that everyone doesn't have to become an expert. Everyone doesn't have to have a graduate degree or, have read Stamped from the Beginning and Cast and a dozen other books to just start talking with their kids. I think it's okay to start with where you're at, even if where you're at is, I don't know how to talk about this, and expressing and sharing that with your kid. But if I were to offer you just a really easy place, is ask your kid, have you ever heard the word racism? And do you know what it means? And see where your kid goes from there. I promise they won't say, this makes me uncomfortable to talk about it, or I don't want to talk about this, or I don't like that subject. I guarantee you they'll get really excited. They'll want to dive in. Kids love being asked questions, and that's a really great place to start, I think.
Awesome. So about how to talk to the kids. So one person asked, how do we talk to 6 or even 8-year-old Black boys about the climate of the world today? They see and hear things constantly. How transparent do we need to be?
Well, look, I can't speak for you, for your homes, for your classrooms, whatever context you might be in. But, I take to heart honesty is the best policy with my own kids. And so we have those conversations very directly. And if you are their parent, navigate that in a way that you would navigate a conversation about just about anything, which is know your kid, know what they can handle, what they can't handle, what they like, what they don't like, what they understand, what they don't understand, and provide context as much as you can. And so for me, I've got 6 kids all the way from 2 to 17. Those conversations look different because my kids are different. And they're also different ages, and they're also at different developmental stages. That doesn't mean that I'm sort of looking in a book and going, oh, they're at this developmental stage. That must mean that I must start this conversation in this way. I fundamentally believe that when it comes to the option of talking about racism with your kids and doing it the right way, and not talking about racism, the most default option for most parents or for most grownups is to not talk about it at all, because they're afraid they're not going to say the right thing or say it the right way. And I can tell you that very few parents mess up their kids by having conversations too early. Way too many mess up their kids by having conversations too late. Because if you don't think a little Black 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old boy is thinking about these things, is talking about these things with their friends at school, with their friends online, with other family members, you're wrong. They most certainly are. And when you choose to not participate in these conversations with your kids because you don't think they're ready, they will just go get their answers from somewhere else.
So what are your thoughts about teaching kids to celebrate differences versus, and I was brought up this way, being colorblind, thinking that saying, well, I'm colorblind is, I don't see color, when obviously we do. And so how do we manage that?
Yeah. Colorblindness, in some ways was an overcorrection from the Jim Crow era, from segregation. It was color is emphasized in such a way to be discriminatory. And so, I, as a woke, white person, am going to not see color anymore. I am just going to see a human, a person, and I'm going to value them and give them dignity and not judge them by the color of their skin. The problem is that's not what really ends up happening in those moments, and those intentions aren't quite as pure. I would contend, and many might disagree with me here, that color blindness itself is a form of racism. Because here's what color blindness says. Color blindness says that to recognize you as a human, as a person, as someone valuable and worth dignity, I must take away a part of your identity to then see you as valuable, to see you as significant, to see you as equal. And it is only when I take away that part of your identity that I can offer you that same kind of dignity that I would offer myself, which is code for, and the best way to sort of put what color blindness really means is I'm going to treat you as if you were white, right? That's the way that ends up working out. And kids learn that and they grow up that the default, the normal is white. And when somebody diverts other from that, right? Whether they're black, brown, Asian, you name it, now I have to be colorblind with them to not see their full personhood, to offer them value. And you can imagine how destructive that might be for a little mind, right? Whether that's a white kid growing up to never see those individuals as full people unless they take away parts of their identity, or for a black and brown person like myself who goes, so you don't see me? You don't see my color, right? It can be very damaging.
So as a white middle school teacher, how can I have a conversation with my students when some don't even believe that racism and white privilege exists?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I've spent quite a bit of time with different educators, and I find educators are much better at navigating this than I am. Here's what I'd say is start with what you know, both from your education and from your experience, because those will be things that you can anchor into, and teach from that place, right? While also recognizing that it's not your job to change every kid's mind in the class, right? As much as they tried to teach me long division, I'm not sure I ever quite picked it up. I'm sure there were kids that did that. But try and teach the other kids in the class. And if they pick it up, great, awesome, wonderful. And if other kids push back at it, then hopefully they ask thoughtful questions. It's not necessarily your job to change their mind or convince them. It's to convey to them what you believe is true. And again, not just true because you say it's true, but true from experience, true from education, et cetera. And then as you get good questions from kids, I think it's okay to say, I don't know the answer to that. Or let's look it up together, and be a learner alongside your students. I wish I had more teachers when I was in grade school and middle school who said, I don't know, and were willing to help find the answers. That would have empowered, I think, me to know that I'd asked a good question.
So when our kids are seeing the unjust society that we live in today, how do we help them channel their grief? What are some things that you maybe have done with your own kids to help them walk through the grief of what they see on TV and what's happening?
In a lot of ways, that question assumes a lot, and I applaud it in a lot of ways, because it assumes that that you as the parent recognize they're grieving. And I think that is 90% of it. That your kid is not acting out, that your kid's not being obstinate, that they're not just saying no for no reason, right? That they're not being sullen or just want to spend all their day on a screen because they're bad kids. It's because they're grieving. And what do we all need when we're grieving? That can look like 1,000 different things, but often it's just time or space or attention or quality time. I think validating kids for what they're feeling, right? Asking them questions, letting them share them, empathizing with them, and letting that last as long as it needs to last, knowing that it's not just to get over it. It can be heart-wrenching. And I think especially in this last 12 months, we have all been experiencing a collective grief because of the pandemic. It is why I'm here virtually, right, and not in person. And that has been compounded by the continual sort of, destruction of Black bodies at the hands of police officers. And that's difficult for adults. Imagine what that's like for a kid. So even just sitting with them in that, hey, any of you parents on the call, if you're doing that, you're doing a great job. You're doing way more than my parents or most parents that I ever see do.
So you've given us, your book on how to talk to kids about racism, but what advice do you have to create that safe place for adults and parents to get together and really start that conversation when so many of us, it's not a comfortable conversation to have?
Yeah, two things. One is, get over it. It's not going to be comfortable.
Right.
That's it. It's just not going to be comfortable. We just got a little exercise bike. Like, it's just not comfortable the first few times you do it. Right. And it might take you a couple of months to really get into it so that you those muscles are going and you feel comfortable. And with talking about racism, most adults are at like a second grade level. It's like we're just learning how to read, right? And we stumble over our words and we sort of don't know what we're saying and we're trying to navigate it. And the only way to get better at it is to do it, is to try it, is to ask thoughtful questions, is to listen, is to put yourself in a place of a learner instead of saying, well, the thing about police and brutality is, and pontificate because you read something smart in the Atlantic. I think it's just get comfortable being uncomfortable. And then the second part is don't make every Black and brown person in your life your personal, racial consultant. They're not. They're just simply not. It's okay. And this is like, I'm granting you the permission. It is okay if you are white to talk with your other white friends about racism. It's a safe space and you can talk about it and you can make mistakes. You can say the wrong thing. You can say, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Like, you can practice and try stuff out and that's okay, right? In fact, I wish that happened more. Instead of every time that something happens, right, my white friends reach out and go, what do I do? What do I say? As if I'm the authority on those things. And you can imagine that starts to get a little bit sort of pressing, as if
Right.
I speak for all Black people. And so I think it's important to have those conversations in spaces where, think about it like a reading group. I was a bad reader as a kid. So, they put the kids in the reading groups of their reading level. Go find your reading level. Go find a group that's at your reading level and talk about it and conversate.
That's some great advice. So I once heard that if you hear someone say something racist, not to confront that by saying you're racist, but by saying what you said was racist. Do you agree with this tactic?
Honestly, I'm such a realist that I think most of the time in those situations, nothing gets said. And even that's in a context where everybody knows the right thing to do and doesn't do it, because it's hard as hell to do. And I'll be the first to raise my hand and say, there have been times where something has been said and I just froze, right? Because I'm all at once feeling trauma and also feeling like I need to diffuse this situation because I spent a lifetime learning how to racially diffuse a situation and laugh stuff off. And it's really hard. Um, so that's my like realist sort of like, saying nothing is typically the default, whether that's right or wrong, that's just reality.
Right.
I do agree, right? Saying somebody is a racist is an identity thing. It's really tough to put on somebody, but saying something is racist, can be removed from the person and yet connected to them because they said it. I think the R word is the new N word for white people, right? Being called a racist is the worst thing
Mhm.
you can be called. And I have yet in my entire lifetime to ever see a single individual cop to being racist, just ever. I've never seen it. And so you are unlikely to succeed by calling somebody out in that way. It is almost always either for the benefit of others or to stop that behavior in its tracks, even if it's argued with and disagreed with. Um, uh, Again, I like, even my book, I really struggled with how to end it for my kids because I was like, I can't say, if you see something, say something, because it's really hard. It's really hard. And we
Yeah.
know, sort of with the bullying epidemic, when kids are getting bullied, it's one of the best things that can happen, but it's one of the hardest things to happen, which is a kid steps up and says, "Hey, please stop." Um, so that's my very poor, terrible advice. But yeah, I think that sort of calling the thing racist instead of the person, I think, is an effective model for engaging.
Great. So how do we help our children support their friends of color and show their allyship?
Hmm. I'll try and speak from first person experience here. Um, Let me speak on the macro level and then I'll get to the first person. Um, we in America, just generally in Western culture, are bad at acknowledging bad and painful things. We're just bad at it. When people die, right? What do we say? I'm so sorry for your loss. Or we say things like, God has a plan, or it's going to be okay, or, and we show up to this very nice thing where there's like, olives and little sandwiches, and we talk politely for a while, and it's sort of not polite to like cry and wail, and then we all sort of go back to our lives, and then we hush tones, instead of engaging directly with it and sitting in the pain of it and acknowledging the difficulty of it. And so I think the one of the best ways that one can be an ally is to recognize um, the pain of racism and acknowledge it, right? And also and treat it with respect, meaning that's something that a lot of Black and brown folks carry with them a lot of the time, actually. And so giving respect to that, acknowledging that, and not like joking about racism. I find a lot of folks who sort of fancy themselves as great allies sort of go like, oh, but racism can also be a joke. And it's like, well, also not, and I think there's some
Yeah.
really good corollaries here for supporting women, actually. I think when one thinks about the gender bias or sexism or the pay gap or those sorts of things, it's very easy to go, that sucks and that's wrong and it shouldn't be like that. And to sit in that place, acknowledging that thing. But when it comes to racism, it starts to get really fuzzy and weird. And so I think being able to sit in that place to go, that sucks, that's wrong. You don't need to go propose a way to fix it. You don't need to bring by some baked mac and cheese, but just knowing that there is that actual allyship of that recognition of the thing. And then also not the presumption that you can do anything about it, right? Not the presumption that you can go show up to a thing with the sign and somehow fix it.
Right.
But the acknowledgement I find is one of the most powerful things.
So since the verdict will be happening in the George Floyd trial. Sorry, I pronounced his name incorrectly. In the event of either outcome, are you already preparing, and how are you preparing to talk to your kids about the verdict?
Well, I'm going to start with the first part of what you said, and then I'll get to the second part. We have a habit of taking the most victimized person in the scenario and making them sort of the center of that thing. So it is the Derek Chauvin trial, right? Not the George Floyd trial. Last I checked, George Floyd was not on trial. But our language is important in these contexts, I think, because it puts emphasis. The best way to think about it is, very few of us are familiar with the Bill Clinton scandal, right? But all of us are familiar with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, right?
Right.
How a 20-something intern became the center of that thing when the most powerful man on earth. I mean, it's crazy, but that's how we end up getting there. So that language, I think, is important. Look, again, I would just lean on the fact that I am not an expert. And so those conversations, they're sort of ongoing in our family. And look, my kids, both my white kids and my brown kids, they sort of intuitively know, without me telling them a lot of things, actually, because I mostly try and ask them questions, that there is a systemically unjust system. And so the outcome of the Derek Chauvin trial might very well be a slap on the wrist, or it might be that justice is done. But they're also, and again, this is just sort of real talk with my kids. It's like, they're also aware that that doesn't mean that everything's better all of a sudden.
Right.
That all of a sudden, racism is fixed in America because look, one cop went to jail for murdering somebody. It just doesn't work like that. And so while I think there'll be some relief and some comfort, if indeed justice is served, there'll also be a healthy amount of skepticism. And so I don't, in some ways, I don't need to prepare my kids because it's not a conversation we're having once. We're having it sort of in an ongoing manner. And that's maybe my only good piece of advice through all of this is don't try and talk to your kids about racism once. It won't work. This is not the birds and the bees talk. And not even that works, right? You can't just talk to your kids about sex once and somehow assume they know everything about sex.
Right.
Talk to them about it more than once. And if you leave that door open, they will come back to you and they will ask you things. And as they grow up, they will learn new things and they will come to you with things. And so I'm not preparing my kids because I expect fully that either they will see my grief or I will bring something up, or they will bring something up, because that's the context we've created in our house. And I don't want to pretend like I'm superhero dad, super woke and doing all the right things here. All I'm saying is that we've created a context in our house where our kids can talk to us about stuff and it's okay. We don't shush them. We don't tell them we'll talk about it later, or you're not old enough for that. If they're old enough to ask, we talk directly with them about it.
That's some great advice. Anti-racist has become kind of almost like a tagline that's come out in the past year. So what does it mean to you to be anti-racist? And how is being anti-racist different for adults and kids? Or is it different?
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit out of my pay grade, to be honest. The second part of that question, fundamentally anti-racism, is a proactive state. To say, I don't have a racist bone in my body, or literally, I was spending time with a friend from college and he's like, well, I'm not racist. And what's implicit in that is I am not capable of doing something that can be perceived as or is actually racist. And that's just a fundamentally wrong way to look at racism in general and acts of racism. I like to refer to it as accidental racism. That's a lot of racism. Another way to put it is systemic racism. But I think most people don't realize certain things they say or certain things they do might indeed be racist. And so a state of anti-racism or being an anti-racist means that you are proactively dismantling racism, which means acknowledging when something is racist, acknowledging those racist tendencies, beliefs, biases within yourself. There's a really wonderful DE&I coordinator for the NFL, and she starts every talk with, "I am a racist." And it gets everybody's attention in the room because that's a wild thing to say. And I really appreciate, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, because he also refers to himself as a racist within his own work, that he has racist tendencies and biases, because we all, well, I don't want to speak for all of us, those of us who have grown up within the United States of America suffer from the legacy of its systemic racism as a country. African Americans have spent more time as slaves in this country than they have free from slavery. And no, like this is the craziest thing. It's this wonderful sort of a quote from this book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. No adult living today will be alive when folks will have been free as long as they will have been enslaved in this country. And so being a recipient of that history then means it's sort of baked into our bones that there are parts of all of us, both white and for those Black and brown folks, that are systemically built in. And so being anti-racist is a proactive state of undoing that. Now, what that means for adults and what that means for kids, again, that's a little bit above my pay grade.
Yeah. Would you be willing to host another event about some of your other books? Because your ability to normalize these tough topics is really inspiring. And
thank you.
And it breaks it down in a way where it's like, oh, this isn't a scary topic. Because I think for adults, we think these are scary topics to talk about. Yeah. And they're really not.
And I think the reality is because we are scared. And like, look, I don't believe in ghosts, but I try and turn on lights when I walk into rooms because I don't like to be dark, right? Like,
right.
It's hard to quantify or to deal with fear, whether it's well-founded or whether it's not. And so our hope in making these books was to tap into, I think, the truth that kids don't have all the baggage that grown-ups have. They just don't,
Right.
When you bring up a topic like shame or body image, right, or death, they walk in sort of going, "Oh, I'm interested in learning about that. What's that?" And it's this wonderful moment. Whereas adults, they have experiences, they have thoughts, they have ideas, they have wrong ideas about things. And they also have learned to grow up in polite society where we've all learned, don't talk about these things, otherwise you're a jerk. Right. Mm-hmm. What do we learn, right? Like, don't talk about politics or religion at the dinner table. And we've spread that out to many, many different topics. And so having kids engage with these topics, one, changes what'll be okay for them. Imagine that group of kids, those 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, engaging with these topics then, what they'll be like as adults. But it also meets adults where they're actually at. And what I find for my book and a lot of our other books, where I find that I'm a learner too with those topics, is that many adults are at that kid level where they need that kid language to just understand something, because we all like to pretend as adults that we know everything, and we sort of politely nod at each other, when we hear things like compound interest and, NFTs and, anti-racism, because we don't want to look dumb. We don't want to look stupid,
Right.
And kids, they don't care, they don't care about that stuff.
Right. So if we truly want to educate our children about our true history, what guidance, or have people already reached out to you with guidance to give our boards of education on how to evaluate our history books for our students?
Yeah. This one's a tricky one, but in some ways it's really simple. And it took me a little bit of time to understand. And so forgive me if I digress for a second, but I was trying to understand why what I was doing with our publishing company, A Kid's Book About, was new. It was really like kind of flummoxed me because I sort of thought like, this is really obvious, like really low hanging fruit. Like I'm kind of not even trying. Um, and then I started to meet the CEOs of other publishing companies, um, and big ones, not little ones, like $100+ million a year. And then I realized that they were all the same person. They were always a dude who was white in his 40s or 50s, who had came up in the publishing world. Um, and I realized that I was just a different person. I didn't fit that avatar. I had a whole group of different experiences. And this is why I spent so much time going through my story, because I think our stories impact so much of what we end up doing and the way we view the world. Is mine is one of trauma and tragedy and heartache and difficulty and you name it, especially as a person of color. And so I walked in outside of the publishing industry with an idea to do some books. And so naturally, all the things that were on my mind were fundamentally different than the traditional sort of publishing apparatus. And believe it or not, publishing has been around for thousands and thousands of years. And across the last few hundred years, it hasn't changed much. There's a reason why there's a lot of prestige in publishing a book, because it's a very gatekeeping industry. It's really hard to get into. And for industries that are really hard to get into, guess who usually gets into them? You can just like really obvious here. You have money, you are white, and you are a man, right? And so there's a reason why these kinds of books don't get made. And so it's a long way of me saying, I think for a lot of these things to change at the educational level, it'll be about having those folks who are in power, who are both consciously and subconsciously through their own experience, through their own ideas that occur to them, bringing and putting in place new kinds of media, new kinds of materials, right? And that's a very long game, because it takes new textbooks don't get made every year, right? New materials don't get made every year. Administrators don't change out every year. And so it takes that sort of force of will by having some of those folks who are Black and brown, who are women, who are disabled, right? Who don't fit sort of the normative typical person, to be making those decisions. And then they end up reaching lots and lots more people. So as valuable as I think what we're doing is, and it'll reach a lot of kids through different schools, I think having more and more folks who are in a position of power to make those choices will really systemically sort of change the education apparatus.
Well, we are almost out of time tonight, and I think I can speak on behalf of everyone online. Thank you. This has been just a great way for us to start the conversation and realize it's not as scary as we tend to make it. So you said you have a 2-year-old, and somebody did ask kind of how to start talking about racism with little ones. So what are those conversations like with your youngest?
Yeah. I'm gonna be a little annoying here. It's like, what is any conversation with a 2-year-old like? Right. So like, I don't know. I'm not like a, GMO, gluten-free, like granola dad. Like I'm just a dad. My kid probably, is on screens too much and eats too much sugar. But here are the little things we do. We talk about skin color, right? Because my skin is a different color than his skin, than his mom's skin, than his sister's skin, than his other sister's skin. And guess what? He'll be the first one to bring it up, right? Because kids are like that. And they start to build ideas around who is safe and who is not, and who is like them and who is not, before two. And so it's important for us to make talking about skin color okay. And then as those things start to come up about who's safe, who's okay, who's not okay, is to invite those things in. And so at some point we're going to be at a grocery store and he's going to be 4 and he's going to go, why is that person that color? And we're not going to go, oh my God, he brought up skin color in the grocery store. We're going to engage, right? And we're going to talk. And I think kids will take you on that journey with them without you even needing to try. And if any of us really looked ourselves in the mirror, we'd realize we stop our kids from meaningful conversations all the time. We just stop them in their tracks. We go, oop, we're not going to talk about that. That's not okay. That's not appropriate. You're not old enough. We have all these reasons and they're all code for, I don't ever want to talk about this because it makes me feel uncomfortable, right? But the kid invites us into it. So take those sort of teachable moments, I think, for what they are. And you know, get rid of this colorblindness stuff. Get rid of this idea that we all bleed red. Again, because it just defaults back to this place of going like, it's okay to be white, but if you're not white, we got to treat you like you don't have a color at all. Like it's just, I mean, like it's a level of absurd that, you know, only can exist in racist ideology. And so recognize people for what they are. It's okay.
That is some great advice for us to end on tonight. Jelani, thank you so much for joining us. I hope everyone walks away with just a little bit more insight than we had when we hopped on here an hour ago. For our TCU friends, we want to make sure that you know that you can join this conversation by being part of the DEI work with the TCU Alumni Association. In the wrap-up survey that you will get tomorrow, we will include some more information about how to join that conversation. And you can also look at Horned Frogs Connect and log into there and find the DEI committee and the different subcommittees within that we would love for any of y'all to join as we continue these conversations as TCU alumni moving forward. So thank you, everybody. And thank you to the Black Alumni Alliance and the Fort Worth chapter for bringing this program tonight. Y'all have a great night.
See ya. Thanks for having me.